As we neared the peninsula of Gallipoli, the captain of the destroyers gave the order for silence and for the men to stop smoking, and thus, in the darkness and in silence, we were carried towards the land which was either to make or mar the name of Australia. On either side of us we could dimly see other destroyers bearing the rest of the 3rd Brigade. I am quite sure that very few of us realised that at last we were actually bound for our first baptism of fire, for it seemed as though we were just on one of our night manoeuvres. But very soon we realised that it was neither a surprise party nor a moonlight picnic. At about 4 a.m. we heard the first sounds of firing, and at 4:10 a.m. we first came under fire at about 200 yards from the beach. The captain of the destroyer gave the order, "Man the boats, men," and without the slightest hesitation, the first tow filled their boats, took up their oars, and started to row for the beach, amid a perfect hail of bullets, shrapnel, and the rattle of machine gun. That was Captain Ivor Margetts in a letter home to his family, recounting the morning of April 25th, 1915, that every Aussie and Kiwi knows only too well, the morning the Anzacs landed at Gallipoli during World War I. Known to his family as Captain Ivor and known to his friends as Margo, Ivor Margetts was a teacher and AFL star and an all-round nice guy. He was also the only officer to survive the entire Gallipoli campaign from the first day to the last, only then to be sent to France, where he became the first person to die at Pozieres. And he was my first cousin twice removed. Let's hear all about him in this special Anzac Day episode of Ratbags and Roustabouts. Now, for those listeners not in Australia or New Zealand, Anzac Day is commemorated on April 25th every year as we remember all those who have served our nations in arenas of war. But it was born out of that early morning attack that Ivor Margetts described in the letter I just read to you, when the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, better known as Anzacs, landed at Gallipoli in Turkey to launch what turned out to be an ill-fated campaign during World War I. The main aim of the Gallipoli campaign was to take the Dardanelles Strait in order to capture the Turkish capital, then known as Constantinople. Obviously today it's Istanbul. The Ottoman forces were at the time fighting the Russians in the Caucasus region, which is between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So the idea was that by taking Constantinople, it would relieve the pressure on the Russians. None of that happened. In reality, Gallipoli was a complete disaster. In fact, the most successful part of the entire campaign was the troops' withdrawal from it. And it was actually Winston Churchill, who is so famous for getting Britain through World War II, who was in a large part responsible for the disaster of Gallipoli. In World War I, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He helped orchestrate the Gallipoli plan and was also involved in planning the landings. It was such a complete balls up that he ended up getting demoted and resigning from the government. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's meet our hero of today. He's really neither a ratbag nor a roustabout. In fact, he's possibly one of the few sensible people in my family tree. His name is Ivor Stephen Margetts. Ivor was born in Launceston, Tasmania on September 4th, 1891 to Stephen and Charlotte Margetts. He was the middle child of 5 boys. His father, Stephen, was the brother of T.B. Margetts, who we heard about back in episode 7. You may remember Stephen was one of the brothers who wrestled the gun out of T.B.'s hands during his daughter's wedding. Ivor was smart and sociable and sporty. He was a hulking 6'3" tall, that's 190 centimetres, and was a talented Aussie rules player. In 1912, aged 21, he moved to Hobart and took up a position as a sports teacher at the Hutchins Boys' School. At the time, he also played AFL semi-professionally, well, as professionally as you could back then, and he played for Lefroy Football Club. In fact, Margetts was picked for the Tasmanian team in 1914 and was actually at the Australian National Football Carnival in Sydney when Australia joined the war in August 1914. A month off his 23rd birthday, he was quick to join up. In Hobart, he was so loved at his school that the other teachers chipped in to buy him a pipe as a farewell present, which they gave to him at a going-away party held in his honour. There's a report on the party in the Hutchins School magazine of September 1914 that says this: "In making the presentation, Mr. Bullough spoke of the happy disposition Mr. Margetts possessed and his power of keeping the master's study in harmony by his ability for turning everything into a joke. Mr. Margetts suitably responded, saying that if his nature was a happy one, he couldn't help it, he had been born like it." It seems like Ivor's good nature continued through his military service. There's a newspaper report from 1916 which printed part of a letter from a soldier describing Margetts. "A gentleman and a soldier, I think that covers a great deal. The men simply worshipped him, and what's more, he had that knack of knowing how to treat his men. He always got the best out of us without any trouble." When he joined up, Ivor was made a lieutenant, part of the 12th Battalion that sailed from Hobart on October 20th, 1914. His younger brother Ralph also joined up, and the pair were sent out on the same ship. Ivor kept a diary throughout the war, but it was his pages and pages of detailed letters home that give us the best idea of his experiences. These are kept at the Australian War Memorial, but while a few lines have been quoted by historians here and there, Ivor's words, which are so eloquent, have really not been heard until right now. Years ago, I went to the Australian War Memorial and actually took copies of the letters that they hold on record there, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. In his first letter home, 5 days into the journey, Ivor seemed excited and happy. "I am sitting in the saloon while the old ship is rolling from side to side, and some of the officers are talking and some are playing the piano, and we are all as happy as kings. The first night out I had a very bad head and was very tired. I was in charge of the guard to keep people off the wharf and to stop men from getting off the boat to kiss their relatives and girls, sweethearts, etc. And I can tell you, I witnessed some very pathetic scenes and had a good deal of work to do. I was quite glad when the boat moved out and we waved farewell to our friends from the deck." The ship sailed to Egypt, where the men spent time training in the desert. This is where one of the last known photos of Ivor was taken, standing tall and proud in his uniform in front of his tent. His war diary is fairly succinct, but there are flashes in there that divert away from the usual work of training for war. He mentions visiting an ostrich farm in Heliopolis, a concert one night, and doing night outpost duty with the Morning Stars. He also wrote about a picnic at the Sphinx where he had his fortune told. He did not say what that fortune revealed, though. Of course, in his letters home, Ivor allowed himself more freedom to write at length while staying within the censor's parameters. He spent a lot of time telling his parents how fat he and his brother were getting. In one, he says Ralph is as fat as a seal. But you have to wonder if this is possibly stretching the truth so as to reassure his worried family. He also talks about the importance of receiving letters for all the men now so far away from home. "If you could only see both officers and men hovering round the mail sorter, going all hours of the night for fresh bags, leaving meals, everything, just to get the letters from the loved ones at home. We had been on a bivouac for 3 days and the men were dirty and without any money, but the first inquiries when we got back were not for food, drink, money or any such other trifles. No, letters. I got a letter from Ruby Smith the other day in my budget of 12 letters. Some officers got about 30, and there is always the keenest competition between us as to who gets the most. You might get a few circulars and post them to me to help swell up my total when the next mail arrives." Finally, after months of training in Egypt, the troops were sent to the Greek island of Lemnos, and from there on to Gallipoli. And so let's talk about that morning of April 25th, 1915. About 16,000 troops landed on the beaches around the Turkish peninsula in the early hours that day. 2,000 of them would be dead or wounded by the end of it. That is 1 in 8, not great odds for this British plan. And it didn't get off to the best start when the Anzac troops went to the wrong beach. So the plan was for British and French forces to land at the southern tip at Cape Helles, while the Anzacs as well as artillery units from the British Indian Army were to land further up along the western coast of the peninsula. Where the Anzacs were meant to land was a headland called Gallipoli, about 20 kilometres north of where the British were landing. But whether it was the dark night or the tide or some other factor, the Anzacs actually missed the spot and landed about a mile north of where they were supposed to, at a place called Arieburnu, which soon became known as Anzac Cove. Over the years, a lot of blame has been put onto this one mistake. At Gallipoli, the land rose more gently to the hills of the peninsula, whereas at Anzac Cove, there's just a few metres of beach before you hit this notoriously rugged terrain that goes up to steep cliffs. But perhaps the bigger fault lay in the British underestimating the Turkish defences. In reality, the Turks had already identified Gallipoli as a likely landing place for an attack. So if the Anzacs had landed where they were supposed to, it's likely casualty numbers would have been higher because at Gallipoli there was barbed wire stretched across the beach. There were machine guns trained at the beach. Of course, at Anzac Cove, things weren't much easier. In fact, they were difficult in a different way, let's put it that way. It too was defended by the Turks, and on top of that, the troops had this awful terrain to navigate to get up to the ridge in the dark as bullets were whizzing around them. It's important to remember as well that most of the Anzacs had never been overseas before, let alone in a war. And as an official country, Australia was only 14 years old at this point. There was a lot of national pride, and the volunteers in the AIF were eager to do their country proud, to show Britain, Mother England, what Australia was made of. But some of them wouldn't even feel Turkish soil beneath their boots. Ivor wrote a long and detailed account of the Gallipoli landings. I turned round to get the second tow ready when a man just in front of me dropped, hit in the head. This was the first casualty, and very soon there were several others hit. There was some difficulty in getting the second tow ready, but eventually when a naval cutter came alongside, we got in and started for the beach. 3 men were hit before the boat struck the shore. When she hit the beach, I gave the word to get out, and out the men got at once, in water up to their necks in some cases. Men actually had to swim several strokes before they got their footing. It was almost impossible to walk with full marching order, absolutely drenched to the skin, and I fell twice before I got to the dry beach, where I scrambled up under cover of a sand ridge. I ordered the men to dump their packs off, load their rifles, and waited a few seconds for the men to get their breath. It was just breaking dawn, and as we looked towards the sound of the firing, we were faced by almost perpendicular cliffs of about 200 feet above sea level. And as we were of the opinion that most of the fire was coming from this quarter, it was evident that this was the direction of our attack. Therefore, after a minute or two, having regained our breath, we started to climb. Australia's official war correspondent, Charles Bean, wrote his own detailed report of the Gallipoli landings. Things went to plan at first, with the moon setting right on cue at 3 a.m. so that the troops could come quietly into shore in the darkness. But it wasn't long before those first boats were spotted. Bean wrote this: "Bullets struck fireworks out of the stones along the beach. The men did not wait to be hit, but wherever they landed they simply rushed straight up the steep slopes. Other small boats which had cast off from the warships and steam launches which towed them were digging for the beach with oars. These occupied the attention of the Turks in the trenches, and almost before the Turks had time to collect their senses, the first boatloads were well up towards the trenches. Few Turks awaited the bayonet. It is said that one huge Queenslander swung his rifle by the muzzle and, after braining one Turk, caught another and flung him over his shoulder. I do not know if the story is true, but when we landed some hours later, there was said to have been a dead Turk on the beach with his head smashed in. Bean also mentions the machine gun which the Turkish forces had trained on the boats of the 12th Battalion. He describes how during that first day, 2 stretcher bearers were trying to rescue injured men still lying in the boats when they were shot and killed. Instead, another group of stretcher bearers had to wait until dark when they managed to save 9 men who had been in the boats 2 days and who had spent that whole time afraid to move in case they were spotted by the enemy. In Ivor Margetts' more succinct diary entry for April 25th, 1915, he undersold the whole thing quite considerably. This is what he wrote. April 25, 1915, Sunday. Landed 0420. 3 men hit on troop deck and 3 men in my boat. Colonel Clark shot. Major Charles Hazel Elliott wounded. Captain Layla killed. Pat killed on left flank near me. Slept with Colonel Smith on beach till 4 a.m. Rained. At 4 a.m. reinforced New Zealand company. Shell heard but dug in fairly well. Pat was Lieutenant Peniston James Patterson, the first Duntroon graduate to die in the war. And Captain Laylaw, well, his story is one of those wonderfully unbelievable Anzac stories. You don't know whether it's true or whether it's folklore, but it is too good not to retell. Joseph Peter Laylaw was the grandson of Peter Laylaw, a very well-known Australian, celebrated for leading the uprising at the Eureka Stockade on the Victorian goldfields, and who was later elected to the Victorian Parliament as a member for Ballarat. As legend has it, Captain Laylaw of the 12th Battalion had hidden his grandfather's sword, the same sword that he'd brandished with the rallying miners at Eureka. He'd hidden this in his luggage when he joined up. Now, officers did have ceremonial swords as part of their uniform, but they'd been instructed to leave those behind in Egypt when they were shipped off to the Dardanelles. Laylaw apparently did no such thing. There are several reports of Laylaw carrying a sword on that first morning at Gallipoli, so it's very possible that the story is true. But as legend has it, a few hours after landing, Laylaw was leading D Company towards Baby 700, one of the troops' main objectives. Charging ahead with his revolver in one hand and his sword in the other, they came across the enemy. Now here the story splits into 2 versions. In the first version, Laylaw raised his sword and called to his men, "Now then, 12th Battalion," at which point a Turkish bullet hit him in the head, killing him instantly. In the other version, which has a higher body count, the story goes that Laylaw's body was found, his 6-shooter empty and 6 dead Turks around him. And then lying across Laylaw was a 7th Turk, Laylaw's famous sword, having dispatched him after his gun fell empty. Laylaw's sister-in-law, who was serving with the Red Cross in Egypt, fully believed the second version of events, writing this of her brother-in-law's death. "He must have had a splendid fight and a glorious death. I'm glad to know that he went out just that way. It would have been the way he would have chosen." Margetts' account of the first day mentions Laylaw, among other things. It seems that Ivor spent a large amount of time running up and down the near vertical slope, dodging gunfire, trying to deliver messages and help whoever he came across. After making it to the beach from the ship and catching his breath, he described climbing with Colonel Clark and Lieutenant Patterson on hands and knees up to the top of the first ridge. That's where Ivor finally got his first look at the enemy. Up to this time, I had not seen the sign of a Turk, but as we moved a little to our left, we discovered a trench overlooking the beach and, fixing bayonets, we received the order to go for it. But unfortunately, the Turks had no desire to wait for us when they saw the bayonet. They cleared out in great disorder, leaving much ammunition and some equipment. Our men opened fire on them and several of the enemy were wounded. It's at this point that Colonel Clark is shot through the heart while trying to send a report to brigade headquarters. Major Elliott then tries to go to his aid when he's shot in the arm. Patterson's now in charge, and as everyone is mixed up after the chaos of the morning, they decide to try to regroup. They realise The Turks are trying to go around their left flank, and Lalor decides to push up to the ridge. Margetts is sent up to the ridge, but when he gets there, he's told they're almost out of ammunition, so he goes back to try to get more supplies sent up and to find his own men when he comes across Patterson. He describes trying to make his way through the scrub under heavy fire, frequently falling because the undergrowth is so thick. He comes across Lalor again, who sends him back down to the beach to send up reinforcements and stretcher bearers. This is what Ivor writes. I rolled down into the gully, sniped at all the way, and made my way towards the beach. It was just as much as I could do to get back, as in places the mud was up to our knees and I was thoroughly exhausted before I left the firing line. He gets the message across before collapsing with exhaustion. He's then ordered out again with another group of men, but they're brought back in, as by then it's nightfall, and they spend the night on the beach. After much of the same the following day and night, Ivor wrote this. Hardly any of us had had any sleep since the previous Friday night. We all had beards, no one had washed, and very few of us had found time to respond to calls of nature. I think another 24 hours and most of our nerves would have been absolutely ruined. For my own part, I had no overcoat, my trousers were torn in ribbons, and my boots were laden with mud. But nevertheless, dirty, weary, and cold though we were, we had the satisfaction of knowing we had done what was asked of us. Ivor's brother Ralph wasn't with him on the beach. He was stationed on a medical ship in the Dardanelles Strait. Eventually, the brothers managed to be reunited briefly, and Ralph wrote home his own account of Ivor. He was well but very untidy, said he was fighting like a wild Irishman with most of his clothes torn off. I have since heard that Ivor was seen on the beach with what few of his men were left. You can't imagine how pleased I was to hear about him. It was reported on board that he was the only officer left of his battalion. The whole Gallipoli campaign was a case of one step forward and two steps back. By the time the Turkish force launched a major counter-offensive in May, the Anzacs were pretty well dug in and had had a chance to build their own defences, so they managed to fight back, killing up to 10,000 Turkish soldiers. Another major offensive by the Allied forces then came in August, with some of those well-known battles at Lone Pine, the Neck and Hill 60. At Lone Pine, there were around 2,200 Australian casualties and 5,000 Turkish casualties. A total of 9 Victoria Crosses were awarded during the entire Gallipoli campaign. 7 of those were given just for the bravery shown at the Battle of Lone Pine alone. There's a quote describing the Battle of Lone Pine, one of the most brutal and one of the most famous assaults of Gallipoli. But it's a quote that could almost be used to describe the entire campaign. An unnamed soldier said this: "We were like a mob of ferrets in a rabbit warren. It was one long grave, only some of us were still alive in it." We've all heard countless Anzac stories over the years. We've seen movies and watched documentaries. But for me, Ivor's letters give a great glimpse into what everyday life was like for the men there. He doesn't try to hide anything from his parents. He's very open, but he retains his humour and larrikinism. So I'm just going to read a few excerpts from his letters. They don't mention battles or offensives, but they do paint a picture of what it actually meant to be at Gallipoli. June 4th, 1915. We are still in the trenches and have been here for 6 weeks. Have not had my clothes off since I landed and have not had a wash for a week. I am living in a hole like a rabbit. Have had several very close shaves, but, like Johnny Walker, still going strong. The Turks made a big attack last night, but we drove them off, and today they are digging about 400 yards in front of our lines. An aeroplane dropped a bomb 100 yards from my dugout and blew a man's head off. It is rather an unpleasant situation, waiting and wondering where it will drop, on you or on the other fellow. July 4th, 1915. Nothing of very great excitement has happened since I last wrote to you, except the flies have received huge reinforcements, for they seem more plentiful than ever, and one has to be very careful or he will get a mouthful of them while endeavouring to convey biscuit and jam to his mouth. When I get home, the first thing I propose to do is to chain my clothes up in the backyard or lock them up so they cannot get away, and then soak myself in a bath for a day or two. It is 4 months since I've seen a girl closer than 700 or 800 yards away, and that was at the island before we came here. I almost forget what they are like, and I hope they do not forget me and all get married or anything like that. I do not know how a man is to settle down at home after a life such as I have been living during the last 12 months. I am afraid it will turn a lot of us into rolling stones which gather no moss. The other morning I was sleeping in the firing line when I was awakened by someone pulling at my leg and telling me to get up. Imagine my delight when I found it was my noble lad Ralph. He seemed perfectly happy and certainly looked splendid, with the exception of the fact that as he had not shaved for about a month, he had a scraggy growth of hair on the end of his chin. I got leave to go down to the beach with him and then sneaked off to the boat. You have no idea how pleasant it was to be away from the heat, flies, shells, bullets, etc., just for an hour or two, and I was very thankful to get Ralph aboard, as it was quite unnecessary for him to take risks unless they have to be taken. So I gave him orders not to come ashore again, but to stay where he was, as he was safer there. I went down for a swim last night. They have cut out swimming in the daytime as too many were hit, and the Australians, being a very casual bird, would not take cover when the shelling of the beach started. July 22nd, 1915. Dear Mother and Father, I am on my midnight shift and am improving the shining hour by writing to you. I saw Ralph the other day. He, with the rest of his section, has landed from the boat they were on and are now living like us in holes dug out of the ground. On the second day after they landed, he and Sergeant Armitage were sitting near their dugout when a huge 6-inch shell blew their dugout to pieces. It landed about 3 yards from them, and neither of them were hurt in the least. Rather an unpleasant serenade for their first 2 days ashore. I wish that he had stayed on his ship, as they were much safer there and more comfortable. August 1st, 1915. Since we have given up touring and taken on the profession for which we originally enlisted, i.e. soldiering, it certainly seems much more likely that you two old people will last me out. In fact, several times I have had a sort of feeling that there is a slight danger of getting hurt at war. With a few aeroplanes dropping bombs on one and 6, 7 and 10-inch shells flying about, to say nothing of 100,000 Turks who would like to shoot you with an ordinary rifle, you seem to feel that it would be a nice quiet change to be in Wynyard for a week or two. We are having a rest out of the trenches, but as we get the benefit of all shells aimed at the trenches that miss their intended mark, you can see that it is not a great rest to one's shattered nerves. August 9th, 1915. I was very pleased that Ralph, who was suffering from diarrhoea, was sent away before we started shifting. The last I saw of him, he looked anything but well, but I am sure that he will be all right if he only gets a chance away from this exciting place. I was very pleased to hear about those turkeys which you say you're fattening, but there are 2 little things you seem to have overlooked. One, by the time I return, they will probably have had thousands of descendants, which will extend to 10th or 11th generation. Mightn't they be a little tough, as we are in for a long job by the appearance of things? 2, don't you think that goose would have been much nicer, as we have seen so many turkeys killed lately? 20th of August 1915. This is just after the Battle of Lone Pine, which the 12th Battalion contributed 2 companies to. Our battalion has just been actively engaged in a fairly heavy operation, and although it cost us some valuable men, yet we did splendidly and received personal congratulations from both the Army Corps Commander, the Divisional Commander and the Brigadier. So naturally we consider our regiment as top dogs and are one and all proud to call it my regiment. The men did wonders against great difficulties, and I am sorry that I am not able to give you a full description of the operation, but if you could have walked through the captured trenches on the day after the business, you would have gained an idea of what capturing a trench really means. I will try to describe it. The trench was very narrow, and of course, as it was made by the enemy, it was made for them to shoot in the direction of our trenches. The trench smelt just like a slaughterhouse in the cleanest parts of the trench, and in others it is impossible to describe the smell. In other parts of the trench, dead bodies were stacked in heaps in places where there was available room, and in other parts, where there was no room, they were left in the floor of the trench and covered with a thin layer of earth and made a soft, spongy floor to walk on. Of course, as many as we could get rid of were thrown up to help make bulletproof parapets and also to make a barrier to block up communicating trenches leading from Turkish reserve trenches. As some of these bodies had been dead for some days when I went through and were horribly swollen, remembering that the weather is so hot that one wears as little clothing as possible, it is necessary to try and describe the stench that the men were eating, fighting and sleeping in. In the trench, I counted 7,435,365,165,073,982 flies who walked first on the perspiring live men and then, so as to cool their feet, they walked on the dead ones. November 10th, 1915. Last night a bomb landed where 5 men were sleeping, and the company commander, arriving on the scene later to investigate the amount of damage, was horrified to find an identity disc lying in the trench next to a pair of braces and then what appeared to be a pair of trousers torn to bits, like material just out of a rag mill. Then he came upon a boot blown in half. You can imagine by this time he had sent for a bag to gather the parts he wanted to hold the burial service with. But no, it happened to be this fellow's turn to take some of his clothes off and have a night's sleep. So the clothes were taken off and put down beside his head. The clothes were blown, as described above. The man was waked up and, except for a sore bum where a piece had hit him, he was none the worse. The clothes, alas, were no more, and the man will either have to get a fresh issue or come home in the twilight, as the hymn says. So you can see we have a few wonderful escapes. Today a man was busily engaged easing his mind on the latrine, that's French for dunny can, when a bullet hit him right through the ear. I do not know how it did not hit him in the head, but the fellow came down with his ear bandaged up, or what was left of it, smiling all over his face. In late November, Lord Kitchener arrived at Gallipoli and spent a couple of hours surveying the area, and then he spent a couple of days in talks with senior command. They were worried about the strong Turkish defences, the supplies and extra troops that would be needed, and they were worried about getting through the winter. So the decision was made. The Allies would withdraw. Between December 15 and December 20, each night, thousands of troops quietly left the peninsula. The key was to trick the Turks into thinking everything was normal, as they were worried that they'd be cut to bits if the enemy knew they were evacuating. So while at night men and equipment sailed away, during the day they made sure that it was seen that there were supplies coming into the beach and being unloaded. But while the commanders were busy making sure the withdrawal went without a hitch, in their final moments at Gallipoli, the Anzacs were busy making sure to tidy the graves of their fallen comrades, sad to leave their mates behind. Even the military chaplain, Walter Dexter, walked through the cemeteries and gullies, sprinkling silver wattle seed as he went. By December 19th, there were only 10,000 men left. They made sure that through the day they looked super busy so the enemy wouldn't realise how few of them there were. In the afternoon, they began a pretend attack to distract the Turks, and at dusk the rear guard began to leave. Only 1,500 men remained in the trenches. Then those men began to leave as well. A few parties remained with the job of firing a few shots and making enough noise for the Turks to believe everything was normal. They also set up self-firing drip rifles, which used a system of a tin of water dripping into another, which would then fire the rifle when the weight in the bottom tin was heavy enough. By 4 a.m, the last stragglers left and the final boat sailed away. The Gallipoli campaign was over. But the war wasn't over. Far from it. For Ivor Margetts, that meant France and more horrors at the Western Front. Ralph, though, he didn't have the same constitution as his brother. His diarrhoea was in fact dysentery, and he was never well enough to return to the fighting. About the same time that he was sent home to Tasmania, Ivor was sent to Pozieres. There's another letter, this one undated, which seems appropriate to read here. By this point, Lieutenant Margetts was now Captain Margetts, and the task fell to him to write letters home when one of his men was killed. I have been rather busy writing to broken-hearted mothers, giving them details regards killed and missing men. It's not a nice job, but I am getting a dab hand at it. Every one different and quite original. One has frequently to cut out some of the details. People ask if you can tell their last words and who was holding their hands when they snuffed out. I could not very well say that the poor chap was cursing fairly well and was being held down on the stretcher by 3 or 4 dirty stretcher bearers. It wouldn't be long before Ivor's parents got similar correspondence. In the final letter from Ivor to his parents that's held at the Australian War Memorial, he seems happy to be away from Gallipoli. May 9th, 1916. My dear father and mother. This is a great country, and I think that we are not seeing it at its best, but all the same it is a lot better than Gallipoli, for we are living in houses and are fairly comfortable. After coming from Egypt, where everything was sand as far as one could see, you may judge how we appreciated the change. Then, also, there are some very pretty girls here, which makes the country more interesting, naturally. I have just had 8 days leave in England. It was lovely. I had 8 days and I enjoyed every minute of it, save the last few when it was forced upon me that I had to go back to France. I only wish they had sent me to Australia for a week. I would not like the return much. He finishes the letter in his usual jovial manner. Give my love to all my friends and tell any who complain that I have very little time for correspondence. That was in May. 2 months later, he was commander of the 12th Battalion's A Company when they were sent to the small village of Pozieres. The outskirts had been captured on July 22nd, and the following day it was reported that the village was clear. That evening, Ivor led a small party in to survey the area and plan where the trenches would be dug. But it turns out the village wasn't clear. At around 9 or 10 p.m, a piece of shell the size of a penny hit Ivor in the heart. He died where he fell, in the arms of one of his men. This man, a stretcher bearer named George Mackenzie, buried him and erected a small white cross over his grave. A picture of that cross features on the cover of the book by Les Carlyon, The Great War, but it didn't stand there long. The Germans came through and the cross was lost forever, along with the exact location of Ivor's grave. A colonel wrote home telling of his shock at his friend's death. You cannot imagine what a grief it is to me to have to tell you of Ivor's death. Somehow we were all so sure that he, above all others, was going to come through all right. This time, the letter to the broken-hearted parents was written by Private Mackenzie, who had been with Ivor right at the end. I heard your son calling me. I crawled over to him and he said, I have got one at last. I got him into the trench and ripped his shirt and singlet with my scissors and found a wound over his heart about the size of a penny. I dressed him and gave him a drink, but it was all over. He lived for about 20 minutes. I stayed with him to the end, and these were the words he said before he went. Is that you, Mackenzie? Yes, sir. If you get through this stink, lad, which I hope to the God above you do, let my people know how I got hit and died thinking of them. He caught my hand and passed away. I left him till the morning and got him buried and put a cross over his grave. I was all through the Gallipoli muck with your son, so I ought to know him well. There was never a better officer living than Captain Margetts. He was the most popular man in the Bat, and he never done a bad turn to anyone since we left Hobart shore. It is the worst shock the 12th Bat has had since war started. Anyone would have gave their life for to save his little toe. Ivor's name now appears on the Roll of Honour in Canberra, one of 103,000 names lining the walls of the War Memorial of those who have given their lives for their country. And today, and on every Anzac Day, it's a time to remember those who died, like Ivor, and to remember those who survived, like Private Mackenzie, or like my great-uncle Alan Cross, who was injured in France, or like my grandfather, stretcher-bearer John Langford, and thank them for what they gave us, for the costs they bore to keep us safe, lest we forget. And now, I know it's been a while between drinks for ratbags and roustabouts. I've gone back to working full-time, which is good for my bank balance, but not so good for my free time. So between that and dealing with 2 young kids, finding the hours and days that's needed to research and write these episodes has unfortunately become near impossible. So for now, I'm sadly calling time on ratbags. It has honestly been the most enjoyable experience. I've really loved doing the show and I'm genuinely sad to stop. But never say never. There may be the odd episode that turns up now and again, and who knows, maybe I'll lose my job again and I'll have oodles of time to bring it back to life. Thanks to all of you who've listened along and never stop learning about those unsung heroes, those down and outs, those people who were condemned to being nothing more than the footnotes in the history books, those ratbags and roustabouts who we love so dearly.